Our topic today has everything to do with animals, of course, within a filter and context of the religion of Islam. We'll dive deep into their independent relationship with God and within the universal faith. And we'll also examine how we as humans have warped such an existence of animals with interpretations that suit us as Muslims and that fall in line with our behavior, obviously by ignoring the more applicable findings of Islamic scripture and tradition. My guest today is Dr. Sarra Tlili, a scholar of Arab and Islamic studies, currently sharing her vast knowledge at the University of Florida. Her primary research interests are stylistics of the Qur'an, animals in Islam, and Arabic literature. We'll be discussing her vast expertise on the avant-garde readings and findings in the Qur'an when it comes to animals, and also speak about how humanity, and namely Muslims, have strayed in their understanding of the status of animals within Islam. Welcome to the Candidi Chronicles, Sarra. It's our pleasure to have you and to host you on this conversation. And I just want to dive in very quickly from the very beginning. I'd like for you to establish a datum point concerning how Islam presents and positions animals as a whole. What's their purpose of their existence? And how does it compare to humanity's own existence? And purely from a reading of the Qur'an perspective.
Thank you first for having me. Now, of course, when you say what Islam has to say about animals, Islam is a very, rich tradition with so many different views. And if we want to say what the Quran says, the Quran also is open to different interpretations. My reading of the Quran tells me that like the view that it has of animals. The Quran in general, I think every Muslim will agree that it is a very theocentric book. It's centered totally around God. Usually, like most Muslims would say, yes, of course, it is centered around God, but God privileges humankind. Humankind have like in a way, God's favorite creatures, or they are the telos of existence, of creation. I don't think this is actually the case. My own reading is that status in the Quran does not depend on species membership. It really depends on obedience to God, like the level of your obedience to God. And this theocentrism, which I think every Muslim would agree about, actually the thing that shows that the non-human creation in general is much more valued than we tend to recognize. The Quran and the Hadith agree both, like they give the non-human creation agency. They depict them as God conscious, as creatures who praise God all the time. For example, in verse number 44 in Surah Al-Isra, Surah number 17, it says that وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ. There is nothing, everything, like everything in the cosmos praises or hymns God's praises. So the Quran and the Hadith both ascribe this spiritual dimension to non-human creation. And I think this emphasizes the Quran's theocentric character. Like it's showing that God is totally at the center of everything. The entire creation worships him, not just humans. And the thing that the Quran values more than anything else is obedience to God, is submission to God. The Quran also says that everything submits to God. وَلَهُ أَسْلَمَ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. So everything has submitted itself to God. Now, what is the aim of the Quran is to invite humankind to also submit themselves to God, Islam, right? So what the Quran is doing, and the Hadith, by the way, as well, they're both inviting humankind to join the rest of creation in submitting themselves to God, in worshiping God. And because, like the Quran depicts the non-human creation in such a favorable light, for me, this shows that they enjoy a truly privileged position, so they are spiritual, they have agency, they have types of consciousness that are beyond human ability to conceive. Like they worship God in ways that are not clear to us. Like the Quran says, وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُم. You do not grasp their way of praising God. In Surah An-Nur, when it says, like كُلٌّ عَلِمَ صَلَاتَهُ وَتَسْبِيحَهُ. Each creature has learned its prayer and it's praising Him. So, like they all have ways of worshiping God, but we don't see that. We don't have an idea about like what is going on. But clearly, the Quran and the Hadith ascribe spirituality, agency, morality, choice, many features that we tend to reserve to humankind or to the so-called like rational creatures like jinn, humans, and angels. In fact, I think a close reading of the Quran says that they are common to the entire creation, but we don't know them, like we don't see them, we cannot experience them. So that's my view. Like the Quran's theocentric character, like the fact that God is at the center of everything, ends up giving value to the entire creation. The humankind are also part of that, but their in a way their status actually does not depend on their species membership. Their status depends on their obedience to God. Like you earn that status. Like we have the potential of like kind of gaining God's pleasure, but it's not guaranteed just through species membership, if this makes sense.
It brings up a thought in my mind when you actually qualify that calling to humanity as almost a slice of a larger calling to submission for all creation. So what we look at strictly as the book, the holy book, and nothing but that holy book could be actually a medium of communication strictly for humans, but there are other mediums that aren't necessarily written or spoken, but they have a different channel of communication that has reached those sentient beings. Is that a correct reading?
Correct. And it's actually not just like my reading or your reading. It is the reading of some Muslim scholars as well. So, for example, the Quranic exegete Al-Baghawi says that God has ways of communicating with each creature that are beyond humans' ability to understand. Muslim exegetes also, like at least some of them, have also kind of perceived this, like, and in a way, it kind of expands our way. It opens horizons. It creates a space for our imagination to imagine things that are there but we cannot conceive. Yes. So yes, I think it does this, and we are not the only ones, in fact, saying this. Like some pre-modern exegetes also said the same thing.
So then, can you explain how we got to where we are now, where we have this very progressed concept of anthropocentrism within the ever-changing interpretations? And,
Yes.
and they actually contradict the datum point you mentioned and you began with, where
Yes.
it's not even. We're not all on an even scale. We are above others as humanity.
Right. Let me perhaps ask you, like, what gives you the idea that there is this prevalent anthropocentrism in Islamic tradition? Where do you see it?
No, it's not about Islamic tradition. It's about Muslim way of life and behavior in general. How we perceive that other beings are subservient to us. They tick certain boxes for us, whether it's labor, whether it's food, or whether they are just below us as an existence.
Right.
I think that's what we see. That's what's prevalent in the modern. I don't want to restrict it strictly to modern. I think this is a very historic thought or mindset that existed way back in the day at the outset of Islam. And we'll get to maybe some of the reasons for that, in my opinion. But I think this is something that does exist. It is prevalent. And also we see it when we don't give those believers, those creations, the same weight that we give ourselves.
Correct. I totally agree. I mean, it is definitely there. Anthropocentrism is definitely there. It has always been there from the beginning of the tradition. I do personally believe that it has been on the rise, like it's like I think in the earliest stage, the tradition was a lot more theocentric. Then it became in the Middle Ages, and it has even become even more anthropocentric in the modern age. I mean, it is a theory that, like, it is an impression that I'm having from my readings. I haven't researched it specifically to kind of to double check, but it is an impression, a strong impression that I have. Where does this come from? First of all, we tend to be self-centered creatures, like what like we have this tendency across the board. It's not just like at the species member. We tend to think of ourselves as the center of the world. Our culture is the best culture. Our You see, like, we do this. However, we are not, like, the moment we take the time to rethink these assumptions and we strive to expand our horizon, we discover little by little that no, actually, I'm not at the center of the world, and my culture is not the best culture in the world. Like it. So it's usually like it requires some effort from us to and like to kind of reconsider these assumptions. We do this when there is a trigger, or when there are like certain motivations urge us to do this. Like, for example, I think nowadays more and more people do not consider their cultures to be the center of all cultures. They acknowledge that no, actually there is a diversity of cultures, and this is actually a good thing because it is enriching, etc. We used to be very androcentric. Men are better than women, more intelligent, more this, more that. It took a lot of effort for us to reconsider that, like, and now I think more and more people are saying, no gender is better than the other. We actually, like each gender kind of has something to offer, and we enrich one another. The same is happening now with in at least in Western academic circles. Like the assumption that humans are at the center of everything is being challenged more and more. And so, like, I see, like, at least in my field, that those assumptions that were very prevalent are now being reconsidered. So what I'm saying here is that we always start with self-centered assumptions. It takes effort to kind of reconsider them, and that's one of the reasons why Muslims are anthropocentric. In this sense, we are not an exception. Everyone starts off as anthropocentric. There are other reasons. As Islam started to expand beyond Arabia, like right after the first few decades, actually, it came in contact with many other worldviews, faith traditions, etc. And in the give and take of civilizations, like, many nations took Islam, but like at the same time, Islam took in many views and many assumptions and many methodologies from other traditions. Louise Marlowe has written an excellent book about hierarchy and egalitarianism in Islamic tradition, and although she does not address the human non-human dimension, she still shows how Islamic tradition, after a very strong egalitarian thrust that you see in the very first few decades, it becomes more and more hierarchical in general. So, like, and she says that this is mainly because of Islam's interaction with Indic and like Eastern traditions in general. Because so like Persia, for example, definitely took Islam. Like it became Muslim, but it also changed Islam tradition in this sense. And we see that with the adoption of hierarchical thinking comes a whole set. It's not just like at the gender level or at the class level. It also affects the species level. It affects many levels. One of the philosophies that influenced Islam very profoundly is Hellenism, specifically Greek philosophy. Like we see, for example, how in Neoplatonism there is the great chain of being, which arranges the entire cosmos in a hierarchical scheme. right? So you start with the one, which is the equivalent of God in Islamic tradition, going down to the kind of very simple matter, and everything, like in this scale is arranged hierarchically. Like difference always means higher or lower status. You cannot be different while you cannot just be different. If you're different, you're either lower in status or higher in status. And we see that this is actually something that many philosophers, many theologians took from Greek, like Neoplatonism, Hellenism in general. For example, a great mind like Fakhreddin al-Razi, he's brilliant, but he totally accepts as scientific the way we believe in modern science. He believes in a Greek philosophy, and he arranges the entire world in a hierarchical sense. So, like for him, it's not just like that humans are better than animals. Animals, like certain animals are better than others. For example, elephants are better than, I don't know, like he has his hierarchy. Each philosopher and each thinker has their own hierarchy, but they all agree on the principle of hierarchy. So this is another reason why we are anthropocentric. I think also, like in the modern age, a lot has happened. Alan Mikhail, I think his name, has written an excellent book showing how um, modern culture in general, and in the case of Ottoman Egypt particularly, how it changed Muslims' attitudes toward animals. So although we used to think that yes, we're more precious to God, we're better, but we used to value them still as God's creation and relate to them in so many ways. But with modern culture happened so many changes. Like first of all, we are not in contact with animals anymore. Like most societies are now urban societies. We are so disconnected from the animal world. And once you don't see them, you don't see other animals, you don't observe their daily behavior, you're just basing your ideas about them, like on kind of prevalent assumptions, right? It's in the same way when you don't know about other cultures, you're going generally to assume that they have nothing, like what could they have at the end of the day. Um, and of course, when we say modernity, also we say nation state. There are so many institutions that we used to have, like in connection with animals, many functions. For example, dogs, for example, used to be the protectors of neighborhoods. Now that function is taken by the police. Dogs also used to be the garbage collectors. That is taken by the municipality. So we created more and more distance from other animals, and that kind of reinforced our negative ideas about them, and kind of made our ego even more kind of visible. It is what I'm trying to say. It's like a number of things. It's not simple, but yes, I agree that anthropocentrism is in fact prevalent in among Muslims now, as it is in fact among every other human society, unfortunately.
I mean, you mentioned some very valid points that I hadn't thought of before, especially the cultural, historic influences that came about very early in the conquests of Islam, and how those obviously within other elements of Muslim life, Muslim governance, changed the way those Arab Muslims used to deal with themselves and with others.
Mhm.
Also, the other element of modernity, where you're talking about our distance from animals, has kind of removed that emotional connection, that functionality need that we used to have. So yes, I do understand those, but one of the elements that sticks with me, and I keep going back to it, is because we know from the very beginning of the faith that these are believers. These animals are beings that have relationships with God. Yet we seem to we've seemed to establish this very clear view of haram and halal, what's allowed and what's not allowed. But when we go towards animals, that social behavior is licensed to treat them in a different way. We've kind of established that behavior towards animals, even though it's very clear in our doctrine that we shouldn't. Now, those factors that you mentioned yes, do contribute, but ultimately, I believe Islam does provide clear adherence to certain principles in our relationship towards animals that are now being ignored, in my opinion.
Correct, correct. So first of all, let me say that, our agreement that animals are believers is actually not as prevalent as you might think. Um, Philosophers and thinkers who were steeped in Greek thinking, for example, they tended to de-emphasize the spirituality and the agency of non-human animals. They would, for example, say that, like when the Quran says that every creature hymns God's praises, you should um, interpret this figuratively. It's a figurative way of speech, it's not real. So views right from the beginning were kind of complex about animals. Not everyone shared the same conception of what the non-human animal is. But I mean, there is a strong school of thought. In fact, the traditionalist school of thought, like the Ahl al-Hadith, one of the reasons why they were in such opposition for schools of thought like the Mu'tazila and the rationalists is because they did not want to let go of this anthropomorphic dimension of the tradition, like the fact that we and other creatures are alike. And they clearly emphasize the spiritual dimension of non-human creation in general. They went out of their way to do this. And like it was, of course, met by opposition from like more, in a way, like rationalist schools of thought. Let me say, however, that regardless of how Muslims tended to think about animals, like our conception of the non-human animal in pre-modern Islam did not um, actually have a lot of impact, or it had any kind of negative impact on how we treat them. Islamic tradition, I think this is now widely recognized, widely acknowledged, has one of the best animal ethics. Like attention to the well-being, regardless of whether you think they are below us or not below us. Like we may think, and I think most Muslims think that humans are better than other animals, but this is not a license to mistreat them. So the treatment, the ethical treatment of other animals, down to insects, like every animal, pretty much, um, it was a matter of like hellfire or heaven, like it's punishable by God. Like if you mistreat non-human animals, you have to treat them well. The government had institutions to protect them. Like you had to feed your domestic animals, and if you fail to feed them, the government may take them away from you. Like the muhtasib, the market inspector, one of his responsibilities was to overview the treatment of animals. And if he saw that any animal was mistreated, like there are legal consequences for that. So the treatment of non-human animals was extremely important to pre-modern Islamic tradition. I mean, you could explain part of this as something like it was expedient, because especially like for the animals, when you treat your animals well, they will treat you well, they will be good to you as well. But it was actually, we see very well that it's not just that, like this kindness extended to every creature. It's also treated as a good sign of one's piety, whereas in other traditions, for example, like if you treat animals well, it's often like in Western tradition, pre-modern Western tradition, treating non-human animals well was a sign of being, I don't know, like stupid. Like why would you treat a dog well? Like it's like why would you care? That was not the tendency at all in pre-modern Islam. The treatment, the ethical treatment of non-human animals was extremely important. One of the major complaints of missionaries and like travelers to the Middle East in the 18th and 19th century was that they could not understand why Muslims were so tolerant of dogs and cats, stray dogs, stray cats. Why would they do that? Why would they allow them to bark all night and deprive one of sleep, like many of them say, like if this were in France or England, you would go and kill them all one night and get rid of the problem. Why would not Muslims do that? Someone who is walking or driving a cart or something in the streets of Istanbul or Cairo or something like that, they would have a lot of difficulty navigating their way because of the number of dogs laying on the ground, like all day just sleeping. And if you touch a dog, like it's going to be a huge problem. Like the entire population would go against you and punish you for that. Like you get imprisoned if you do that. So the treatment of non-human animals up to, I would say, like the 18th century was of utmost importance in the Muslim world. And it was a sign of one's piety. Like one of the signs of piety of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, for example, regardless of whether the story is true or not, but like this is treated as a sign of piety, was that when ants became too numerous in his home, um, he just sat in the middle of his courtyard and recited a prayer and like asked the ants to leave because they became intolerable. And although they became intolerable, he could not do anything. Like he could not harm them because the prophet instructed that we do not harm ants. And the story says that the ants left actually. So you see, like this is like treated as a sign of piety of Ahmed ibn Hanbal, like the fact that he treated, like he abstained from killing the ants or harming them. Things started to change, unfortunately, with the transition to modern period, for a number of reasons. Maybe we'll get there as we proceed in our discussion.
No, definitely, it's a quality of the Islamic faith is its care for animals, for non-human animals. I think that's very obvious in every single relationship that we have, whether it is on the highest level of animal in sense of like the largest animals to their most minute insects,
Yes,
for example. So yes,
correct.
we'll get to that aspect of our discussion, but it still takes me back. I'm still challenged by the disappearance or the dilution of the weight of this shift from theocentric to anthropocentric, where we have discounted these non-human beings and we allow ourselves to act a certain way that is not necessarily, in light of all those qualities about Islam and how we treat animals, we nonetheless do treat them as lower than us, as below us. So that's still something that's there. Maybe in our discussion we'll come to terms, or you might enlighten me in a different way. But I think let's go on. I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and in your readings of the Qur'an, one of the things that is a global phenomenon, it's not specific to Muslims, but our humanity's licensing of the cruelty towards animals it's clearly linked with the human condition of cruelty towards their own selves. And I know there are references in the Quran where they equate actions from human to human linked with how a human might act to an animal and vice versa. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, on those readings, on those surahs or verses?
Maybe I don't know if I have like a very clear answer to this question, but let me say what I think about it. The Quran keeps insisting that whoever does an injustice, at the end of the day, they're doing that injustice only to themselves, whether unjust to another human being or, like you cannot be unjust really toward God or toward, like, for example, if I harm a person, yes, of course, I'm causing them like some harm, but the Quran presents this as something that God has already predetermined for that person, like that person is going to be tested through harm and like good things and bad things in life. And like if, for example, I hit someone, right, I hit a human being, and they suffer from being hit by me, it's a test for them from God. Like God is going to kind of judge them on how they react to their test, like what they do about it. um The harm that I did to that person, however, in the end, is only a harm toward myself, because I'm going to be held accountable for that in the hereafter. And I'm going to, unless, like I ask for forgiveness, I'm forgiven. Um, I'm going to pay for that misdeed, right? So everything bad that I do is going to be against myself and not against any other creature. And I think in this way, like harming another human being becomes equal to harming any other creature. Like, like if I do an injustice to any animal, it's not going to go unaccounted for in the kind of big scheme of things. Like the Prophet ﷺ says that on the day of judgment, every like non-human animals in Islamic tradition are supposed to be resurrected and they will face accountability. They also are accountable, and we face our accountability. So, like for example, a bird will go to God and complain that it was killed for no reason. For example, someone killed it for no reason, and we are going to be held accountable for that. Um, so I guess yes. I mean, being unjust toward other human beings kind of leads is linked to being unjust to other creatures, because like if you tend to have this injustice or tendency to be unjust, it is going to show toward different creatures. If you're going to be unjust toward another animal, you're going to be unjust to another human being. You learn kindness, it becomes part of you, and it shows in the way you deal with every creature. Like if you're truly kind, it's not going to be selective. You're kind, if you have kindness in you, it's not going to be selective. Like you start, like you're going to be kind to everyone. And if we are selective, it means that our kindness is not genuine yet. Like, like if I'm kind toward people from my culture, but cruel to people from other cultures, for example. That's not true kindness, right? That's chauvinism. And if I'm kind to other human beings, but not to other animals, that's speciesism. And it shows that I'm not genuinely kind yet, like I still have a lot to work on. So I think by portraying every injustice as truly being an injustice toward ourselves, this is how the Quran and like Islamic thought as I see it, this is how they equalize. Like it doesn't matter who you are unkind or kind to. It's really about whether you are a genuinely kind person or not. If you are, it's going to show across the board. There is a hadith which says, a beautiful hadith actually, which says that like one day there was a funeral, a bier like that was carried, someone died and was carried to their like to the graveyard. And the Prophet ﷺ saw that, and he said, "Mustarih wa mustarahun min." Some are relieved, and some others are relieved from them. The companions asked, "What do you mean? What does it mean?" He says, "The like the pious person is mustarih, is someone who is relieved because they are leaving behind all the trials of this world, and they're going to the hereafter." The one that others are relieved to see, like leaving to see departing, is the wicked person. And in that case, humans and trees and animals and the land, everything is relieved from them. So a wicked person, once they die, the relief comes from them the moment they die, and that relief is not something that only other humans feel. It's the entire creation, the land, even inanimate things will experience that relief once they leave. So it shows that the way we treat other humans is going to be similar to the way we treat other non-humans. Our impact is the same, and like it's like once we go, like that will be known to the creation around us.
What you said raises 2 points, and I think when you say that it's an inward relationship, what you do towards a human or what you do towards an animal, it's a reflection on your good deeds or bad deeds. But the the thought that sticks with me is that a majority of people, I believe, still weigh those good deeds and bad deeds differently between human and between non-human. We still feel that, if we, hurt someone, it's totally different than if we hurt something. The hasanat are different. One is X, another one is 10X, one is higher. So that's an observation that maybe you want to comment on. It's not a question. And the second point, which is a question, and it links with the same, is this notion of nafis and khasis, higher being and lower being. Where did this come about exactly? Is this stated clearly in the Qur'an, or is this coming from tradition? And does it apply to the whole human-animal relationship?
I don't know whether this is like a very prevalent way of describing humans and non-humans. I know that Al-Izz ibn Abd salam uses this phrase, khasis and nafis. I didn't see it that much, but like the core of the idea is, of course, there. We tend to think that humans are more valuable to God, that they are inherently better than other creatures, we tend to kind of link this to rationality. And I think both Muslim, like modern and pre-modern Muslims, tend to think in this way, like we're better because we have reason, whereas other animals do not have reason. They act, like they follow their instinct. Nonetheless, like I think, like in my work, what I like once you start reading Islamic texts, I'm not even speaking here about the Quran and the Hadith. I'm speaking about, like Muslim commentaries and like the wider texts around these two texts. As they go into detail, they start to grapple with these ideas and sometimes even to contradict themselves. So I'll give you an example. The exegete al-Qurtubi, he has like one of the best tafsir, one of the best works of Quranic exegesis, like the insights that he has and the organization and everything. It's really my favorite book of tafsir. So sometimes like he would totally agree with everyone that humans are the best, and this is because we have reason. Like you may think of a number of other things, but really at the core of our superiority is that we are the only rational beings among, like the kind of earthly creatures, not compared to angels and other ethereal creatures. Nonetheless, when he discusses the ant that is mentioned in Surah An-Naml, Surah number 27, he changes his position 100%. He says, this ant and all ants and all animals, like he extends his conclusions from the ant of Solomon to all ants, and then from that to all non-human animals. He says, they actually have minds that are greater than the minds of many, many humans, of most of humans. How is that? He says, because the most important idea ever is to conceive of God, to know that God exists, to accept him as God, to submit to him. And he says, all these animals do that, whereas most humans do not do that. So what we see here is that actually, like many Muslims, contradict themselves. And the reason, in my opinion, like I'm here talking about Muslim scholars, the reason is because they haven't pondered animal themes specifically very profoundly. So what they tend to do is that when they're talking about themes that do not seem to be linked to animals per se, like they're about human beings or other matters, and comparisons come across, they would just switch in the kind of prevalent mode. Humans are the best because humans have reason, because we can do all of these things that other animals cannot do, etc. We have language. Yet, when the Quran challenges these perceptions, many of them would change gear 100%, and we see how the Quran actually inspires them to think more highly of animals. This is not an impact that the Quran has on everyone. Like Arati, for example, he has given this idea a lot of thought, like the animal, the human animal, like interplay. And he sticks to his hierarchical system because he thinks that this is the scientific way of going. So he tends to de-emphasize Quranic themes that ascribe agency and interiority to non-human animals. But with many of them, they actually express ideas that you see in the modern field of ethology or the study of animal behavior. You know that they say you cannot actually compare apples and oranges. Like it's not like about like whether they have reason or not. It's they have skills, they have other skills that like they in which they outperform us. Yes, we may outperform them in this area, but they outperform us in other areas. And the what matters is not whether like it's not a competition between us and them. It's about how each species manages its life. Are they good survivors? Are they taking good care of themselves? Do they solve the survival problems that face them effectively? This is how you measure this success. So we find insights like these actually, which kind of modern philosophy just has reached recently. We find them in a tabari, you know, when he discusses verse number 38 in Surah Al-An'am, which says, وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا أمم أمثالكم.
The
Because the
communities,
Quran says,
the essence of communities.
yeah, when the Quran says that every animal species are nations like you, that the like you part, أمم أمثالكم, nations like you, this triggers fascinating discussion. They start all of a sudden to think, how are they like us? So that like us becomes the thing. And they start looking for things in which other animals are similar to humans. And they say, yes, they actually manage their lives just fine. They will know, like, for example, cows, they know which grass is nutritious for them and which is harmful, and they know how to avoid the harmful one. And they start observing animals and finding skills that show how efficient they are in managing their lives. So they trigger this more egalitarian outlook among exegetes. The problem, however, is that they do not pursue that. They will say things like this when they discuss verse 38 in Surah Al-An'am, but then they transition to a different context and they switch back to prevalent stereotypes. So I think the reason, like for this kind of Hasis and Nafis idea, is just like the anthropocentric tendency that we tend to have in general, and which was not challenged, like it was not kind of taken seriously. Like very few people in the pre-modern tradition have followed that line of thought. The only group actually that did follow that very thoroughly, um, but unfortunately, they still reached the conclusions that, like animal advocates would not find very flattering, are the Ikhwan al-Safa, the group of authors, medieval authors, Ikhwan al-Safa. We don't know exactly who they are because they kept their identity unrevealed, hidden. But they have this fascinating fable. It's translated as the case of humans versus animals in the court of the king of the jinn. Um, and in this case, animals sue humanity for their mistreatment. And then we have a fascinating, like conversation taking place where animals actually challenge all these anthropocentric presuppositions among humans, and they show how our logic is totally inconsistent and not convincing at all. Like for example, the human characters in the fable, they say, hey, look, we're better than you because look at our food, it's much better than the food, like you're eating grass, and but we eat all these nice dishes. And they say, oh, let's look at that, your nice dishes, because you indulge so much in your desires and all of that. you end up harming your health. You eat too much sugar, too much whatever, and you have all of these diseases as an outcome of indulging in these, like delicacies. Um, let's look at the time, how much time you spend preparing that, like how much time you waste on food, whereas our food is right there. We just go and eat. That's it. You know, the other thing is that we enjoy our food as much as you enjoy yours. So there's no extra pleasure that you derive from that. We're just enjoying our food just fine. We love what we're eating. Let's look at how you earn that food. Like sometimes you have to steal, you have to do like very unethical things to obtain that food. And then this means that you'll be punished for that food that you're eating. Whereas we never do that. So if we look at this whole package of food, we're the winners. We're doing much better than you do. And they keep going like one thing after the other, and actually they refute all the arguments by humans. Yet in the end, the human characters win, and the reason is because Ikhwan al-Safa are so steeped in hierarchical things. They are the most Neoplatonists among Muslims. So there was no way for them, despite this fascinating table, there was no way for them to reach the conclusion that animals can compare to humans. The humans had to remain superior, so they had to comprise something totally illogical to allow humans to win the case. But the process itself is fascinating, So like how it leads you to rethink all the preconceived notions that tend to make us think that we're better than other animals. So yes, the idea was challenged. I mean, it was prevalent. It was challenged. I don't think it is actually Quranic. I don't think it is coming from the Quran or the Hadith. I think it's coming from our self-centered tendency in general. I don't think it was as prevalent as we might think now. It has become a lot more prevalent, I believe, in the modern era for a number of reasons. But yes, at the same time, I totally agree with you that the pre-modern tradition also, like many people in the pre-modern tradition, share this position as well.
You're confirming just some of the initial thoughts I had about this, because once you go into a comparative analysis, that is actually not applicable. It doesn't make any sense actually to have that comparative analysis between a human and an animal. Even how we pray versus how animals pray. How do they prostrate to God? Whether spiritually, physically, these are insignificant because we are different beings, but we're believers. This is the problem with the reason why I raise this nafis khasis is because it's a transformation from an idea into terminology that becomes part of our life, part of our spoken words. Today a lot of Arabs use those terms and use them freely to signify a higher or lower being, and unfortunately most of the time when it's khasis, it's in negative connotations. They're not very positive.
Correct.
So that's why I always thought this, and you reinforced it when you mentioned this kind of table that was put together. This comparative analysis, just in my opinion, not applicable, it's actually quite silly.
Let me just perhaps say something. Animal ethicists in the modern time, especially those who are working in religion, often look actually at the language of the Quran to see how it speaks about this, and they find in it many inspiring statements. So, for example, one scholar says, I don't remember her name, I cite her in my work, but she says, when the Quran says about birds that they pray, and then it says, كل علم صلاته وتسبيحه, each knows their prayer and their praising hymns. She says, what the Quran here does is that it expands and frees the notion of prayer, to be more encompassing than what we're used to. It's not that, like usually, like those who want to de-emphasize the spirituality of non-human animals, they will say, hey, I mean, what do you mean? Like animals pray in a literal sense. This is figurative because, I mean, do you think that the animal is going to put their head on the floor and do sujood and do, or do they do this or do they do that? So they take the human model of prayer as the model. And if anyone does not replicate that model, then it's not prayer. What this author says is that actually this is not what the Quran does. It expands the notion of prayer. There is, of course, the core element of prayer, which is obedience to God, like the core essence of prayer in general, right? In the human version, it takes this form, like these specific gestures and like words and body positions and all of that. But it takes a different form with each creature, right? So this shows that prayer is a much more rich and multifaceted phenomenon that we humans tend to think. And this is, I think, what the Quran, like, this is like this tendency to expand our horizon and the horizon of these things. Like there is definitely a core element of everything, right? And the Quran wants to say repeatedly that it's quite rich how creatures relate to God. It's very rich, it's very meaningful. Like the Quran uses these spiritual words specifically for a reason. Like it uses words like salat and sujood, prostration, and tasbih, praising hymns. Like it's kind of deliberately uses these words that are used like to designate human devotional, like states and acts, and it uses them in other creatures, right? So it's meaningful. What they do is meaningful. For us to tend to de-emphasize it or like strip it from meaning, I think in my reading, I'm not saying, in my own reading, I think it kind of strips the Quran from its richness and the world, God's creation, from its richness. It's like, instead of like saying that we are too limited to see what other creatures are truly doing in relation to God, we tend to say, oh no, we know everything, and what they're doing is not as good as we're doing. So like this is how we elevate ourselves and kind of bring them down. It's a reading, like it's a prevalent reading in Islamic tradition of Islamic sources. um, I find it not only like, personally, I find it like not a very plausible reading, but I also feel that it does not justice. It does not do justice to the Quran and to Islamic sources in general.
I agree wholeheartedly, but and I even would add to that the interpretation of what prayer is for humans themselves is also very restrictive. I think when you look at al-fard, the mandates of how you should pray, the actual, your 5 prayers, your sunnah, whatever additional prayers you might perform, there's prayer that goes beyond that as well. There's prayer
Yes,
in your work. There's prayer
yes,
in every aspect of life. And I think,
correct.
the surah you mentioned about the bird, for me, it's an analogy for human behavior as well, that it's
Yes,
beyond what you know or what has
yes,
purely been written. It's across. Prayer comes in many manifestations, and it's kind of
yes,
that relationship that you need to constantly feed and be aware of.
correct, correct. And that connection, that like at the core is that connection between creature and creator, right? And I believe this is the core of prayer in our case. And I think it is also at the core of every creature's prayer. That connection between creator and creation is at the core of prayer. It takes so many different versions, so many different expressions. It does not mean that one prayer is, like there is one model and deviating from it will make the other forms as not versions of prayer. But yeah, yeah.
I want to digress a little with my curiosity. I'm very interested. How did you come about with this perspective, with this view of Islam, not purely from a human angle?
It was a total coincidence, honestly. Um, I just discovered it, like this topic by chance, and like I came like to the United States to do my PhD in Arabic literature, and I'm still infatuated with Arabic literature. But when I was going to work on my dissertation, like the topic that I initially picked did not like was no longer interesting to me, and I was even thinking of like leaving the program altogether. But in the meantime, I had done some work on animals and discovered that, wow, like there is a huge amount of material on animals it's across the board, and there is so little work that is done on this. So I thought of like diving into this. And of course, when you do this, like the first document that you want to look at is obviously the Quran, which is at the center of everything. It took me a lot of time. I grappled a lot with the Quran initially because I did come with all my anthropocentric assumptions. I'm not like like I did not start off as an animal advocate. Like most people who work on animal ethics, you'll find that like prior to this they were animal advocates. They like they experiment with vegetarianism. They do this and they do that. I'm not from that background. Like I really was looking for a PhD topic, and like I knew, like at some point I discovered that this is a very rich field, but initially I did not even think of going there. But then I reconsidered, and when I started, like one of the things, for example, when I started working closely on the Quran, reading it specifically, looking for what it is saying about animals, one of the things I was looking for is what is the word that the Quran uses for animals? Because I thought, like it has to be humans and animals. We're not the same, right? Like we're outside the world of animals. Um, it took me time. No, I mean, there is the word deba, and it's not like when I looked it up in dictionaries and in contexts, like Quranic context, and like I found that actually it not only encompasses the human beings and other animals, but also angels and every creature that produces intentional movement, like any,
I mean, it's beings, all
well,
beings.
not all beings, like like it does not include trees and vegetation, for example, because they don't move, right? So debba is a like a creature that crawls or walks, or you know so it's, and there are two different types of locomotion. It's either that you do it on feet or with your body, or with wings, like when you fly. So the Quran has, like, draws this distinction, like you are either flying or kind of touching a surface when you are moving, right? um but yeah, I mean, we're totally included. Even angels are included in the world of animals. I mean, really, like it's any moving creature, basically. And that started changing my perspective. So maybe we are not as different as we tend to think.
Sorry,
And the
Sarah,
more,
are jinn also included in
yes,
dab? Dab?
yes, this is what pre-modern dictionaries tell us. So the Quran uses this. For example, it says, I believe Surah Al-Shura or Fussilat, it talks about the, like Dabba, both on earth and in the heavens, right? I forgot the verse now. But so when you see like exegetical treatments of this, they will tell you, yes, of course, there are animals also in the heavens. And they identify angels and jinn as Dabba because they're living, they live and they move. So once, like if you're living, like your car is not a Dabba because it's not a living creature. It moves, but it does not produce intentional movement, right? Like someone, like it has to be moved by an external kind of factor. Any creature that produces intentional movement, that it moves by itself, living and and moving, it is an animal. And this is how pre-modern dictionaries define the word. It becomes different in the modern, like modern dictionaries do not do that. Modern exegetes like At-Tahar bin Ashur, for example, says that the word debba does not include human beings, although in some contexts he says it does. But pre-modern exegetes, like they say, كل ذي روح, anything that has a soul. And of course, for them, animals had souls. It's not like in the West. Um, so, yes, jinn, angels, creatures that we do not know anything about, earthly creatures, obviously. It does not include vegetation, basically. These are not animals. And inanimate beings are not animals, obviously.
So you weren't a vegetarian or you weren't vegan, and you had this kind of moment of clarity that
No,
that's what you wanted to do.
when I look back at, like, what I used to think and how I used to be with animals in the past, I feel ashamed of myself, and yes, maybe this will take me to actually like one aspect of an earlier question, like when you ask, why is it that modern Muslims are not as kind to animals as they should be, or as perhaps pre-modern Muslims used to be, because I totally believe that the pre-modern tradition was totally kind to animals. And I think we have lost much of that, not all of it. I see a lot of people actually are really good about, like, in the way they treat animals. They care, like Muslims who care, and not they're not coming from an animal advocacy background. They come totally from an Islam background. Like they want to be good Muslims, and they know that part of that is being good to animals. Um, I wanted, like, before working on animals, I wanted to be a good Muslim. That was always my intention, but I did not know actually that animals were part of the deal. I did not know. So, for example, when I lived in Philadelphia, and there was a lot of like the apartment, the area where I lived was infested with mice. So, like the way I dealt with those mice, like trapping them, I did trap them in ways that I'm totally against now. Like I feel it was so cruel, but I did not see them. I did not relate to them, and the reason is that modern Muslims are not aware of how attentive the tradition is to the well-being of other animals. Now, when I look back, I see that my aunt, for example, she passed away 2 years ago, but like one of the things that in her behavior that stood out to everyone all the time was how kind she was to every animal. Like, like she would deprive herself of her own dinner to give her dinner to a stray cat who enters her home hungry. She would let go of her entire dinner for that cat or for a group of cats, because she feels for them, she relates to them, she feels their pain, and she feels it's part of her duty toward other creatures and part of being a good Muslim. I did not see that as part of good Muslim, like I did not take her behavior seriously. And the reason is there is no training whatsoever. Pre-modern Muslims used to learn to memorize the entire Quran and to know Hadith very thoroughly. They were totally familiar with so many Hadiths which enjoin Muslims to be kind to other animals. That was something that was explicitly taught to them, you know? So they grow up, regardless of what they think, like whether they think that the animal is Hafiz, or, like whether they are anthropocentric, but they knew that the way they treated the animal mattered. They had to treat animals well, because any and every cruelty towards any animal counts, and they will be held accountable for it in the hereafter. I did not know that. It was not part of my worldview. I discovered it through my work, and I feel now what a huge injustice we are doing to the tradition by excluding this core dimension of it, And that again takes us to like one aspect of modernity. It's the new educational system, which is totally secular, which focuses entirely, like on the topics that we all know about. And it does not actually incorporate this dimension. We don't teach our children or anyone all these teachings that are totally part of being a good Muslim, part of the tradition. You have to be like, I see like a lot of people asking, like seeking clarification about the way they needed to treat animals. So like some Muslims are discovering that, oh wow, this is actually a good part of what this religion is about. They discovered, and once they do, if their intention is to become better Muslims, they try to incorporate that, right? But most of us don't know. We simply don't know, because it's not part of the education system. Like the families do not know anymore that this is important. Schools do not know. If you're not receiving this education, how are you going to know?
Yeah, I think it echoes what I said earlier, maybe a little bit about the knowledge of the haram and halal when pertaining to animals. We know it when it deals with other humans. We know it when it deals with morality, ethics in general, but we don't know it with regard to dealing with other non-human
No,
animals.
correct.
It's a completely different equation, as I said, which leads to one believing that the good deeds are less valuable, the bad deeds are less impactful, and hence,
Yes.
disregarded. So I understand that. One question that I always think about, it's about the times that these kind of revelations came about. So when we look back at the beginning of Islam, the Quran was revealed to the Prophet and then to the population of Arabia. But at the same time, these were people that had trade, had a life, had certain obligations, societal behavior that was specific to the time. So whenever I think about animal welfare, although the Quran explicitly presented animals as equal creations, equal to humans, equal to other beings, there was still a translation towards the life of the times. So, for example, I once made a video about how Muslims failed concerning slavery at the time of the outset of Islam, where there were rules put in place, ways of code of conduct that would lead to a diminishment of slavery within several generations. So that would have gone, and it would have been over, and we wouldn't have this narrative that exists today out there that's Islam, protected slavery, and that's a complete untruth. But I look at it in the same way. Did our relationship to animals and animals' kind of deprioritization serve the pockets, the financial prosperity of certain Muslim cross sections of society? And hence, that's why we kind of pushed this narrative that they are sub beings, if I could say that.
I totally see your point. I think what you're talking about, like this kind of the idea of progress, like ethical or moral progress that you see, for example, in the case of slavery, and you're wondering whether this can be extended to non-human animals. I'm not actually so sure of this idea of moral progress. I happen to have a different view about slavery, by the way, but I'm not going to go there because we don't want to complicate it. Yes, yeah, I mean, no, and I'm not qualified to speak, in fact, about it, but I can refer you to someone who can. But what I'm trying to say here is that what we see as exploitation, like, first of all, like animals being subservient or like at the service of humans, I think maybe you are referring to the idea of taskhir in the Quran, like the fact that the Quran, for example, speaks about non-human animals are subservient to humans. Okay, I spent actually a lot of time analyzing this notion in my book on animals in the Quran, and I think we tend to kind of miss certain important nuances of this notion. The Quran says not just about animals, it also says that the day and the night and the moon and the sun and everything are subservient. I mean, what does this mean even? What does it mean for them to be at our service? You know, and what is the aim of the Quran? Is it trying to highlight our status? As I said, like the body, celestial bodies, for example, the day and the night, and all of that. This clearly does not mean that we have control over other animals or other any creatures. It's just that God created this cosmos, this world, with every creature in it, in a way that makes our lives in it smooth and like it kind of adapted it to our needs, right? So, for example, the fact that there is a day and a night, it's adapted to our needs because there is a time where it becomes more, we can rest without lots of disruptions, and there is time when we can work. It's adaptation. It's not that the night is our servant and the day is our servant. It's not that the sun is our servant or the moon is our servant. In fact, when we use taskhir among human beings, it's usually the person that is musakhar that has the higher status. For example, let me give you this example. If um, if I need I don't know, like let's say I need to go to a government office and like for some paperwork, and I know that the people there are difficult, but God puts you in my way and you help me to get my things done. This means that God sakhara, sakharaka to me.
Facilitated.
In a way, like he put you at my service. But I mean, it's not in a subservient way at all. It's like he made things easier for you through the help that came through you. Do you see what I'm saying?
I
I
understand that,
really
Sarah, but you're looking at it towards the word taskhir specifically. I'm looking at it more as a composite of many surahs that speak of animals as there being a resource for food, for example. So when you look at it
absolutely
collectively, they are there to
or to serve us.
sustain our life.
Correct. Correct. And what do like Muslim scholars say about that? They say, yes, the Quran does highlight the way other animals are there to help us sustain our lives. But this is part of a bigger picture that the Quran leaves us to kind of ponder, because all of us are at the service of each other, you know, like even if you take the kind of lower and higher status people into consideration, you will see that, I mean, we are at the service of domestic animals that we own, like we have to feed them, we have to care for them and all of that, right? So you are at their service. There is this anecdote that one of the Mu'tazili scholars relates. He says that once he went to see Al-Ma'mun, the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, and the caliph invited him for lunch. But Abu Alef says that his donkey and his servant were outside and he needed to care for them. So Al Ma'mun immediately ordered that the donkey and the servant also be fed. And so after that, he started saying, God who put Al Ma'mun at the service of my donkey can make this thing easy for me. Like he sees that, and he uses the word sakhar. God sakhar al-ma'mun to my donkey. We are all subservient to one another. You know, this is something that traditional animal theory was in total denial of. They wanted us to have nothing to do with other animals. Don't touch them. Don't use them. Don't eat them. Don't kill them. Don't do any. Just let them be. You know, we see that this idea has now been challenged. Like animal political theory says this is madness. We cannot live without using one another. We must depend on other animals. And in return, they also like like we do things for them and they do things for us. We are interdependent in this life. Like we are interdependent at the human level, but also at the creaturely level. When we see that we are too dependent, this is part of this tendency of individualism in modern thought, especially modern Western thought. Whereas, like in traditional thought, no one is believed to be independent to a level where they can do things on their own. Humans cannot do things without the help of other animals. And if we can, it's because we are replacing animals with our devices like technology and all of that. And that actually is coming with a very negative impact on animals, on us, on the environment. For example, like in transportation, we used to rely on domestic animals, like for transportation, right? Now we depend on more sophisticated and more efficient devices, cars, airplanes, and all of that. Like, look at how organic the use of animals in the past was compared to the ecological footprint of modern technology in general. I'm not like trying to say that modern technology is bad or anything, but what I'm trying to say is that being dependent on other animals actually is not a sign of our higher status. It's not a sign of their servility. And if it is, it's because we are all at the service of one another. This is what many scholars, Al-Jahad, for example, says this. He says, among humanity, among humans, we all depend on one another. We have to be of service to one another. So yes, animals do sustain us for food, for providing fiber, like providing lots of services and animal products and all of that. And I think this is actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Um, However, like there are, of course, ethical boundaries that we need to observe. Like as long as we do this within the ethical boundaries, and this is what animal political theorists are saying now, and this is what Islamic law is very keen to do. Like for example, they tell you you can milk animals, but you cannot harm them in the process of milking them. For example, you have to clip your fingernails because maybe you can scratch the udder if you don't. You cannot milk the mother till the last drop because you have always like the priority goes to her offspring, like like the little calf or the lamb. Their God created that milk primarily for them, so you can only have the milk after they have taken their like they get their fill from their milk. If we do it in this way, observe these ethical boundaries, then using animals is actually not a sign of our privileged status. It's a sign of our creaturely vulnerability. It means that we cannot survive without the help of other creatures. And when we try, it often comes with negative consequences, including for animals. Like, for example, one of the major like block ideas of traditional animal rights theory is that you don't use animals at all. What does this mean? This means that you cannot have domestic animals because the reason why we have domestic animals is because we want to use them, right? Like for food, as sources of food and labor and all of that. They find every use and any type of use as something inherently negative. So what do we do? Like, because in the case of slavery, you emancipate the slaves, right? In the case of animals, they say that domestication is a type of slavery, but they know also that you cannot emancipate domestic animals. They have been changed to a level that they cannot survive on their own. They have to depend, like most of them, sheep, they cannot survive in the wild, right? Like they will disappear very soon. So they say, yes. So what do we do? Do we kill them? This is precisely what we want to avoid. We don't want to kill them. They say, no, you stop them from procreating, as if stopping them from procreation is not a form of violence on their bodies and their psychological state, paternalism, deciding for them without taking, like into consideration what they themselves might prefer. So I don't think actually being subservient, like this idea of subservience, the taskhir, is a bad thing. It's a sign of our vulnerability, of our mutual need, like all creatures need one another. Uh, if we do it within the ethical boundaries that have been laid down, like in the Quran and the Hadith, it can be done ethically. And this is why I don't think there is room here for moral progress in this respect. I don't think it's meant to be changed over time, like, or that our dependence on animals was intended to become less and less until we let go of them. It may. I mean,
But
we
that's,
may be.
sorry, Sarah,
Yeah.
that my question is a little bit different. My question, I mean,
Please.
your answer was fantastic. It answered some other thoughts I had, but my question is about how interpretation of scripture or positioning of animals was coincidentally positioned to serve economic benefits of a
Yes.
certain cross section
Yes.
of Muslim society at the time. So
Yes.
that's why I compare it to slavery, because I think slavery was handled in the same way. There were mechanisms put in place that
Yes.
weren't really followed. And with animals, how I think of it is that animals were positioned as different
Yes.
and less believing, and hence were applied as assets. Were
Yes. Yes.
recognized as assets more than they were as equal believing beings.
You're actually pointing to a huge, major problem in animal ethics in the modern era, um, across the board, but specifically in the case of Muslims. This is the it's called capitalism. It's how capitalism has shaped our attitudes toward animals. What we see today, like, and we tend to kind of justify it in the name of religion, is how we can exploit animals to like a horrendous extent, in fact, without paying attention to religion, and we do this because of capitalism. I give you one example. When you perform pilgrimage, one of the um, like the rites is to the sacrifice. It's not totally obligatory. Like if you don't join Hajj and Umrah, the minor and the major pilgrimage, I mean, there are ways around it if you want, but it's highly recommended at least. Like the least that you can say is highly recommended. And in many instances, it becomes mandated, the animal sacrifice, at least according to the mainstream reading of texts. Now, of course, this is not the only teaching about animals in Islam, like there are so many other teachings. Among them is even like how to kill the animal, like you cannot kill one animal in front of the other. You cannot pull the animal. You cannot like treat the animal violently. All of these teachings are as part of the tradition as the sacrifice rite. Like they're all there. They're all laid down in legal manuals and all of that. What we have taken, like nowadays, the way animals are transported from Australia and like different parts of the world, specifically to Mecca during the time of pilgrimage, you know, it's like one of the it's a huge violation of Islamic teaching. Yet what we see is that I haven't seen actually until now. Maybe I mean I haven't done research, of course, but I haven't seen any Muslim scholar speaking about that. And I don't know, I really cannot understand why this is happening. The conditions in which animals are transported, the mass slaughter that is happening, the way animals are killed in the sacrifice, it's a violation of every Islamic teaching about that. And
Sarah,
what
can
you
I interject because you
yes,
dove into my next two questions simultaneously?
yes, yes, sure.
I want you to elaborate a little because you alluded just now to. Can you elaborate a little on the psychological and emotional factors that Islam is concerned with? And that's with regard to the animal's own state of mind during their sacrifice or slaughter, whether it's for Eid or during Hajj or at any point in time. And that's what we refer to today as one of the fundamental aspects of Halal, right?
Yes.
How we interact and how we do it as peacefully as possible. So I'd like you to expand there before we then go into my second question, which has to do with what you mentioned about the sacrifice and the transport of these animals. We'll keep that for later.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, there are many hadiths which have been taken up by Muslim jurists, and they became like totally part of the ethics of dealing with animals. Um, Clearly, I think that Islam makes it totally um, like permissible to kill animals for food. Like deriving benefits from animals in general, I think it's well established in the Quran and in the Hadith. As I said earlier, it's understood to be part of this interdependence between creatures. Humans cannot live without depending on other creatures, but it has also laid down a lot of rules. So, like one of them, like the Prophet ﷺ teaches us, do not sharpen a knife in front of the animal that you want to kill. Do not kill one animal in front of the other. Do not pull an animal. Do not like exert any type of violence on the animal while taking it for like killing. You have to face the Qibla when you want to kill the animal. You have to pronounce God's name when you want to kill the animal. In fact, you have to say just Bismillah and not Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Like you say in the name of God, not in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. And for some, it's because, like the moment is of taking life. So, it's like in a way saying Rahim at the time you're taking someone's life may not seem very contextually, fitting. But anyway, so it's very like here, I think all of these teachings tell us that from Islamic perspective, it seems to say that the animal has consciousness. They know when they're taken to be killed. They value their lives. Their lives is valuable to God. And the only reason, actually, it is sacred. Their lives is sacred. And the only reason you're taking it is in the name of God, because God has authorized it. If God has not provided this explicit authorization, it would have been haram. It would have been unethical and like forbidden to take the life of that animal. So it is an explicit authorization, but it is an authorization. It is authorized. So God has authorized it, and God has authorized it only for one reason: for food. This led some Muslim jurists, especially from the Shafi'i school of thought, to say that you cannot take the life of an animal for any other reason except food. Like, say, for example, they give you many scenarios. They say, for example, you have a sheep. The value market of that sheep, say it's $100, and it swallows a diamond that is worth $5,000. What do you do? Do you kill the sheep to recuperate the diamond? They say, no, it's haram. You cannot. You say, but I'm going to kill the sheep and then eat the meat. It's not like I'm going to throw it away, They say, no, because your intention is not killing the sheep to eat it. Your intention is because you want to have your diamond. And the life of the sheep is more valuable than that diamond in God's sight. You cannot take the life of a living being for your wealth. God has authorized that only for food, killing them only for food, right? And I'm not saying that this is, something prevalent. Like, so it is Muslim jurists, specifically from the Shafi'i school of law, who say this. Hanafis, for example, say no. Like they consistently prioritize the interest of a human. They say any benefit that you can derive from a human, from other animals, is a good reason, good justification to kill them. Yet they also say that you have to do it within certain boundaries. It's not like they are, indifferent to other boundaries. What I'm trying to say is that this insistence on the value of the life of the animal has led at least some jurists and some schools of thought to perceive the life of the animal as totally sacred, and that it can only be taken for the reason that God has made specifically permissible. Otherwise, it's not permissible. It's, like you cannot kill the animal. Its life is too sacred to be killed for any kind of reason or interest of the human being. Once if we want to kill it for food, that's totally permissible. In fact, no Muslim jurist from the mainstream will ever question that permissibility. And I think it's because the Quran makes questioning that permissibility haram. It does not want us to interfere with that permissibility. Yet they say you have to observe all of these rules. And I think that Muslim jurists and Muslims in general were very careful about this in the pre-modern era. I mentioned earlier the market inspector, the muhtasib. One of his duties was to observe how animals were killed if things are conducted in the public sphere, because they cannot go into the private homes of people and do things. But among their responsibilities was to make sure that animals were treated well, not overloaded, not like while they perform these services, that they have time to rest every day, that they're not overworked, and all of that. There are all of these teachings which presume that animals have emotions, that they value their own lives, that we must respect those emotions, that we have to take their well-being, their physical and psychological welfare into consideration. Muslim jurists, for example, say you cannot separate a mother animal from their little one because that will cause them pain. You cannot, like, so many rules actually, that, like, if we knew that, like when they go to the point you have to clip your fingernails, like, you cannot, when you cut the wool from the sheep's back, you have to be careful not to hurt them. So they lay down by the way, like one I mentioned also political animal rights theory now, and they're saying the same thing. The only point of difference is that they also say do not kill the animal, but Muslims say it's permissible to kill animals. Otherwise, like, there is so much overlap between political animal theory and the traditional Islamic animal theory, especially from the Shafi'i school of law. The interests of animals have priority almost across the board. You can use them, but you cannot use them in a way that violates their well-being or does not take care of their interests. You have always to take their interests into consideration, and you have to respect their well-being across the board in everything that you do. The only thing that is inconsistent with their interests, but you can still do, is killing them. But even when you kill them only for food, and you kill them while observing, like all of these preconditions.
Yeah, I mean, it's very obvious that compassion towards
Yes,
animals is a vital important of the faith.
yes,
Now, you
yes,
mentioned earlier about during the Hajj and at the point of al-Adhiyah, the sacrifice after Hajj. But even bigger than that, when we look at the meat industry and the meat trade that is pouring into the Middle East, the Arab world nations, that's what I know of, approximately 60% comes from Brazil. And you will not believe the level of inhumanity that these animals experience. These are animals that are traveling with chemical injections, with living amongst their own feces, dehydration, many, many different unfortunate conditions, yet are labeled halal upon their arrival into these Muslim nations. And then beyond that, obviously, we, as you said, the way the slaughter, the way the sacrifice is conducted, unfortunately, is as humane as one can imagine and completely uncompassionate. So that's something that is a bit of a hypocrisy, I would say, that we kind of experience today in that part of the world. I mean, you were going to expand a little bit on it. What are your thoughts there?
I totally agree. I totally agree. So I think the violations that are happening nowadays, and the disregard, the flagrant disregard of Islamic teaching on animals in all of this, is just like, for someone who becomes informed about how important animal ethics are in Islam, and for how long the tradition has been careful about this point. Like, it's only in the recent era that like we have these like horrendous violations happening. I mean, I'm not saying that the pre-modern tradition was free of animal abuse altogether. No society can be free of animal abuse. Like, in the same that no society can be free of criminals, or like, you'll always find these things. So yes, there were certain violations in the pre-modern era, but what I'm talking about here in the modern era is that this has become institutionalized. It's it's such a huge part of the of like the setting or the context, and no one sees that as a problem. This is, as I said earlier, this is the way capitalism has like, it's the impact of capitalism, where everything becomes a commodity. So we see that this started happening in the West in the 19th, early 20th century, the commodification of animals. I mean, it started much earlier. In fact, it started with Descartes and the Renaissance, the way animals were totally objectified and believed to be not even sentient, um, and how this gradually shaped Western attitudes toward animals, and then it was passed on to other cultures. The phenomenon is definitely not unique to Muslim societies, but I mean, we're talking about Muslim society, and it is a huge inconsistency in modern Muslim culture. I actually, I mean, this is like, inshallah, like, like a project of a forthcoming book that I haven't even started, where I want to look at the modern period and try to understand where all of this is coming from and what can be done about it. What I believe, however, right now, I think that Muslim scholars in the modern time are not doing enough with respect to this issue. When I look at their fatwas and their, like, writings, their opinions, they still express the same ideas about animals and the need to treat them well. So it's not that they are not taking traditional teachings into consideration, but they're not extending the same creativity toward animal themes as we see with other topics. I'll give you an example. Modern culture in general has come with many challenges. Some of them are about like human reproduction, for example, or the conditions of modern travel. When you go to Hajj, a woman who is menstruating into the traditional context had to wait until the end of her cycle to do, like tawaf al-wada, like if she has her menstrual cycle at that time, she has to wait before to do the final kind of tawaf around the Kaaba before she leaves. In the modern era, this can actually create some very challenging situations for some women because they have to leave by certain dates. And if they fail to do that, the tawaf al wada, this means that they will not be able to have any relations with their husbands until the next Hajj cycle where they go back. So, because of this huge inconvenience that is dictated by modern um, travel, conditions, Muslim scholars issued fatwas telling women, yes, you can actually do tawaf al-wada even if you are menstruating. Take necessary precautions. It would have been unheard of in pre-modern Islam that a menstruating woman is doing her tawaf around the Kaaba. But it was dictated by challenging modern conditions, right? It led to some creative thinking. When it comes to animals, we don't see that. We don't see, yes, I totally agree. Sacrifice is definitely part of the tradition, and I wouldn't do anything to change it, like to change, like it's in the Quran. So I will never go there and change something that the Quran says. Also, like the ethical treatment of animals is totally part of the tradition. We cannot ignore that either. You know, what this means is that we need some creative thinking that is not shaped by capitalist thinking. Governments and scholars must do something about it. The well being of non human animals is an intrinsic part of Islamic animal ethics. It's not a joke. Every animal that is mistreated is going to, like to take its right from whoever is responsible for that mistreatment in the hereafter. I mean, God is forgiving. Inshallah, God will forgive us. But what I'm trying to say is that it's a very, very serious matter. It's not like a light matter. We need to do something about it. And I don't think that we are until now. And I mean, Muslims in general, of course, need to be more informed. I think part of the reason that the wider Muslim generation population are not doing this is because they're not well informed. Like Muslim populations are not aware like how important this, and I think this is also a failure of Ahl al-Ilm, like scholars and people who are in charge. They need to inform the wider population a little bit more, and we also need some creative legal um, rulings, like to regulate the treatment of animals in the modern era. Allowing capitalism to commodify animals in this way is entirely inconsistent with Islam's teachings on animals.
Well, I want to move away a little bit from something so heavy and disturbing to something a little bit lighthearted. I wanted to focus a little on the relationship Islam has with dogs. There's this conflicting narrative by many schools about the concept of najasa, the uncleanliness of dogs. Can you shed light from your perspective how you view this discourse?
It's a fascinating topic. Um, First of all, I mean, yes, like let me say that Muslim jurists and schools of thought differ on this question of najasa. They all think that there is some najasa that pertains to dogs, but some of them see it as inherently najis. It's inherent najasa, like impurity. Like that they are impure. They're they are ritually unclean. Um, some say that it's something inherent to dogs, and some say no, it's not inherent. Like a najasa can touch dogs, but it can also be removed. What is najasa? Najasa is not unique to dogs. Humans also are najis, can be najis, right? Um, I mean, the thing, however, is that in our case, najasa is something that can be removed. Like if you go to the bathroom, after that you're najis. Before you pray, you need to do the wudu, the ritual washing. Same thing with dogs. Like, regardless of whether they're inherently najis or not, the consequences, the meaning of that is that if you touch them, if you touch their body or your clothes, before you go to prayer, you need to wash yourselves. This is the limit of what this means. It's not, like, because sometimes I am asked, does this make dogs haram? What does, like, what is haram? What does it mean, even, like, for dogs to be haram? Does it mean that they're not allowed to live, or that does it mean that you cannot eat them, or does it mean that, no, it just means that they are najis. If I mean, regardless of how you look at this najasa, whether, like, the Maliki's say it's not inherent, others say it is inherent.
Hanbali, or it's inherent, correct?
I believe the Malikis are the most. I have to check my references a little bit more. I thought that the Malikis say dogs are not inherently
Yes,
najis.
Malikis definitely. Dogs are not
Yes,
inherently
najis.
najisin.
And I think the others tend to think
And
otherwise.
Hanbali seems to be the other extreme.
I see what you're saying. I thought you were saying the opposite. Yes. So anyway, like this najasa, like, we tend to magnify it. Like, all it means, regardless of how you perceive it, all it means is that if you're touched by a dog, before you go to pray, wash yourself again. This najasa can come from dogs, but it can come from so many other things, even, like using the bathroom or anything. We need to wash ourselves, right? But questions about dogs in the modern period, I think what this means for most people, the actual implication is whether it is permissible to keep dogs as pets. And here, like, comes the idea of najasa, because if you're keeping a dog as a pet, this means that you're going to, like, the dog is going to be touching you all the time. So you're almost like in a continuous state of najasa because of that. Not only that, but also the space in your house pretty much becomes najas. So it will be difficult to find a place where you can pray. Also, there are hadiths which say that angels will not go inside a place where there is a dog. And some say that this is because of the najasa of the dog. Um, I think what we need to do here is not just, like, look at this issue of najasa. I personally think that dogs are najas and they have the right to be najas. What does this mean? Dogs are indiscriminate eaters by nature, right? A dog that is not trained to be like, in a certain way, limited by training to certain types of food, they will eat everything, including their own poop, right? Including their vomit. In fact, this is how dogs became linked to humans. Dogs were the first domesticated animal in human history, like the first animal that became attached to humans. And it's not even humans who domesticated them, it's them who domesticated the humans in a way. They approached humans. Why? Because they found in the garbage left by humans a good source of living. So this is how dogs became attached to humans historically, more than 10,000 years ago. This is how domestication in general is believed to have started. It started with dogs, and it started through this scenario. Since then, dogs have always lived in the liminal space between culture and nature. They will always be situated between humans and the natural world, in if you want. In fact, even, like, traditional images of dogs, you'll find them at the threshold of a door. They are with a hunter, like, they go with a hunter. So, like, a human being who goes to the wild to catch a prey, they're accompanied by a dog. They're always between that natural cultural realm. The Quran portrays them in that liminal space, like when it talks about the sleepers, the seven sleepers, the companions of the cave, it says that the dog is bil wasid, at the entrance. It's also at that liminal space, because dogs play this, like, they play different roles. One of them is to eat the leftover, the garbage, so that humans leave behind. The second is protection, because they are also they and cats, they are only the only domestic predator. Other domestic animals are not predators, right? But dogs are predators, and because of this, they play this protective role. So the fact that they are indiscriminate meat eaters is good for them. Traditionally, it has been good for them, right? And this means that they are, by human standards, going to be najis. This does not mean anything negative about dogs themselves. It's their niche in the natural world, right? And it does not actually, like the fact that they are in this liminal space does not make the Quran speak any less of them. In fact, it mentions them among this group of pious people. They are the fourth or the sixth or the eighth member of that group of companions of the cave. Like they are part of the sacred history that the Quran depicts, right? So being in that liminal space does not diminish their value in any way. So it seems to me that when we ask about whether dogs are najis or not, what we're trying to ask is, are they clean enough, or can they become clean enough for me to keep them as a pet? And this raises the ethic of pet keeping. It's as if this ethic of pet keeping is innocent. It is actually another aspect of the commodification of other animals. Dogs have suffered the most from this commodification. Not only that, we don't only control their lives, and like we control their very bodies through breeding. Like dogs are the most adapted to breeding more than any other animal. And because of this, we change their very bodies. Like you have dogs that are 200 pounds, and you have the Chihuahua, which is like 1 or 2 pounds. They're all the same species. In theory, they all can interbreed. In practice, it's impossible. Through breeding, we have created dogs with inherent body deficiencies. Like the German wolf, for example, they have problems with their hips. The dogs that have like a very short track for breathing, dogs with so many layers of their skin that like it causes infections, and all of this. So like this, I think, like before asking whether dogs are najis or not, what we need to ask is, why are we asking this? Are we asking this because we want them as pet? And if this is what we're doing, what about this ethic of pet keeping? What about this commodification of dogs? What about the fact that I'm depriving a dog from being in the company of fellow species members to be at my service, just not because of something that I need, like not because of a survival need, as it is perhaps with other animals when I need to eat to sustain myself, but just as for entertainment, for a luxury, you have toy dogs, like literally dogs that are called toy dogs, like the small dogs. And the industry of pet keeping, the horrendous violations that come with breeding, because we only see the edge of the picture, like the tip of the iceberg when we look at this. We don't look at the industry of breeding and the horrendous abuse that happens to dogs that are bred to become pets. We ignore this. We ignore so many things. We ignore the number of dogs that are killed so that the few can be saved and be pets. It's only the extremely privileged dog that becomes a pet and has medical insurance and has all the luxuries, what we think are luxuries. What about spaying and neutering and depriving dogs from reproduction? All of these are also pertinent questions. So I guess like we need to stop asking whether dogs are najis. I think they are najis, and it's not a bad thing for dogs to be najis, you know, because it's linked to their to the fact that they are indiscriminate eaters, and that's good. Like ecologically, it is actually a good thing because it kind of created a balance. Like the garbage that much of it tends to become like a source of diseases used to be eaten by dogs. You know, it was the natural food for them. It does not harm their health in any way. They are created to digest these matters. So yes, there is no problem with thinking of dogs as najis, in my opinion. In fact, I think as Muslims we need to promote this in a maybe like using less derogatory words, using the right word, but it's some like in I see it like it's fine. It's good for dogs to be najis. It's part of their nature, and it's part of it can contribute to a more balanced ecosystem. So yeah, I guess these are my 2 cents on this topic.
No, no, very thorough and very comprehensive. I want to go back throughout our discussion from the very beginning. when we talked about the diminished status of animals within the Muslim psyche, not as equals or even as co-believers. We brought in capitalism. We spoke of them as beasts of burden or assets for consumption. We spoke about how modern animal ethics and welfare is kind of corresponding to old Islamic thought and rules and regulations about animals, or about how we view animals. How do we go about changing this mindset in the Muslim world today? How do we elevate the state of animals to reflect the true status as found within the doctrines of Islam?
What you're doing, we need people to be more informed. I believe, first of all, we shouldn't assume, when we see the kind of less sensitive culture toward animals in the Muslim world, uh, like ascribing this to Islam or depicting it as a failure of Islamic culture in general, it doesn't do justice, because especially in the modern time, how it kind of presumes that every Muslim is so serious about their Islam. I mean, I'm not trying to be judgmental. I know we are all trying, and we are different, kind of levels in our journey. And what I'm saying, however, is that not every one of us, not everyone who identifies as Muslim takes their value system really from Islam. We, humans in general, throughout history, have always been these complex beings. And I think in the modern period, we derive our values from so many different sources. This means, for example, there are many secular Muslims who derive their values from systems that are not necessarily Islam, or at least they are selective about certain things. They may change, they may learn things, and they may actually become more compassionate toward animals by deriving their value system from other systems, which is fine. What I'm saying is, we're different. Each Muslim is different from the other Muslim. But still, I think there are a good number of Muslims who want to be good Muslims, who want to derive their ethical values from Islamic teachings, who are serious about Islam. And I think all they need is to be informed, to be well informed, to become more aware of the centrality of animal ethics in Islam. For me personally, as I said, where I came from, I did not think that it was really a core part of the value system of this tradition. And I discovered this, and the more I delve into any pretty much source, even those who are totally anthropocentric in Islamic tradition, when it comes to the treatment of animals, pretty much everyone agreed that you needed to treat them with care. Philosophers, theologians, jurists, you name it, across the intellectual tradition in Islam. When it comes to treatment, people can think that animals are totally at the bottom level of the hierarchy, but this does not give us the right to abuse them or to mistreat them. Treating them with compassion was a must, and part of it is definitely from Islam. It could be also the influence of other traditions. I'm not saying that Islam is the only tradition that shows compassion to animals. What I'm saying is that the tradition at large truly values the well-being of animals, regardless of what you think about them status-wise. But this is not the case, I believe, in the modern time. And I think what we need, because it's not part of the educational system, I don't think many families stress there enough. It's not like part of the values that they try to instill in their children in general. We all buy meat that comes from factory farms. We don't see this as a problem. Some even kind of portray this as a better quality meat, something that is, for some reason they think, because it's institutionalized, so they think it's more trustworthy. We need to rethink all of this, as individuals, as institutions. Now that social media has opened
new venues for us. I think what you're doing is truly important. I think, and also like we have like many the preachers, the online preachers who you see like very often on like social media venues. They need to say more about animals. I know at least of someone who has one. What's his name? Mustafa. I think Mustafa Hosni. He's excellent. He's really like one of my favorite. And he dedicated one session to animals. But they need to do more. They need like this needs to be more visible in the tradition because it has always been very visible. The number of hadiths that talk about the need to be kind to animals and that highlight the value of animals, it's incredible. It's incredible. This all of this needs to be highlighted, needs to be discussed. The importance of this needs to be made clear to people, help people think better about animals, and help them see that this is a totally central dimension of Islamic animal ethics. It's not about animals, it's about being a good Muslim. Being a good Muslim definitely incorporates or includes being good to animals. Many Muslim scholars, when they start their discussion of the Quran starts with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, the Lord of the worlds. And they say he is not just the Lord of humans, he's the Lord of all creation. And when they discuss the verse, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, we did not send you, meaning Muhammad, except as a mercy to the worlds. They say he is a mercy not just to humankind, he is a mercy to every creature, right? We need to understand that. We need to appreciate that. And we need to implement that in our lives. It's not implemented, at least not to the extent that it should be. And I hope that what you're doing, and I hope more people will do like this, can, like uncover and recover this animal ethics in ethic and tradition.
And book writing, hopefully more books like yours coming up. Do you have a name for the book or still
Yes,
in
so
process?
like my first book was about animals in the Quran. My second book is animals in the Hadith. I like in every time I begin, I think it's going to be a lot more than that. Like when I started animals in the Quran, I thought I will just have like one chapter about the Quran, and then the rest of the book is going to be other things about other things. And then I discovered, actually, after I finished the book, I feel like a number of other books can still be written about animals in the Quran. It cannot be exhausted, like the topic is so rich. And then I started the process again, thinking that I will have one chapter on the Hadith and then speak about other things like Islamic jurisprudence and like other and now I'm discovering, no, actually the entire book has to be dedicated to animals in the Hadith. It's I'm 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 actually totally fascinated by the treatment of animals in the Hadith. It's I hope I can like convey this to the reader. I hope that the reader can see like the originality, the depth, the importance, the meaning of how the Hadith speaks about animals and non-human creation. How animals were one of the determining factor into the direction that Hadith has taken. Like when Hadith started, um, like in early Muslim history, not everyone agreed that about the authority of Hadith. The Mu'tazila, for example, thought that you should derive Islamic like doctrines from the Quran and human reason, not like the Hadith, they tended to de-emphasize it. And one of the reasons is because they were uncomfortable with anthropomorphism. Of course, they were uncomfortable with anthropomorphism as it pertains to God, like when the Quran, when the Hadith speaks about God in using corporeal language, like for example talking about the foot or the fingers of God, this bothered the Mu'tazila, but not the traditionalists. But another actually type of anthropomorphism that has not been explored, which also bothered the Mu'tazila but did not bother the traditionalists, is the anthropomorphism toward non-human creation. The Hadith also speaks a lot about the spirituality, the communicative skills, and all of that of non-human creation. Many creatures speak with them like animals and even inanimate things speak with the Prophet. Like a trunk of a palm tree, for example, suffers when the Prophet replaces it with a pulpit. The Prophet says that the Mount of Uhud is a mount that loves us and that we love in return. Like so many like interactions between the Prophet and even inanimate things, and of course including animals. And all of this did not, please the rationalists. They thought, like this cannot, like it's like these hadiths must be inauthentic. We cannot take them seriously. The traditionalists say no, like they are part of the tradition. The fact that this traditionalist camp won the battle in a way, like the hadith became a core kind of text of Islamic tradition. Animals were part of that conversation. They determined the shape that the tradition ended up taking in the end. So when you look at how central they are, when you discover actually that they are totally at the core of this tradition, it gives you like second thoughts. You start thinking of things a little bit differently. So yes, it's going to be about animals in the hadith. It's like the insights are just fascinating for me. I hope I can convey this. But what matters the most is that how to share this, how can this, it does not remain like constrained or confined to academic circles, like how all of this reaches us all, so that it can translate into concrete good impact on our treatment of other animals.
I think to trigger that interest and that awareness, one of the most important elements is emotional/spiritual triggering, where you need to get people riled up about these topics. And I think with animals, there is this compassion in all good human beings, not just Muslim, but in all good human beings, that once you trigger that compassion, that there's this hunger that gets opened up towards knowing more. And I think, and I wish that's, what happens with your previous book and the upcoming book, inshallah. That sounds very exciting. So Sarra, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's been very, very enlightening. I was looking forward to it for quite a while, and you opened up a lot of thoughts in my mind for potential new content relative to animals. Wonderful. And not relative
I'm glad to hear
to animals. And I hope it was as constructive and engaging for you as it was for me.
Super grateful. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I cannot thank you enough for the opportunity to share these ideas. Yes, thank you very much. And I wish you the best. I will be, inshallah, like looking forward to, I've already watched some of your episodes, but I look forward to watching more content from your channel, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Assalamu alaikum.